If you look back at financial history, you realize that there are many ways to speed up your journey to reaching your financial goals. In fact, did you know that in 2020 alone, if you had managed to pick the best available US stock to invest in each month of the year, you would have grown an initial $1 investment to approximately $11.35 trillion? That's trillion with a T? Well, it's true, as you can see from the returns of this chart. And that's just with $1 of an initial investment during a year that was quite turbulent for the markets as a whole. Think of how much it could have grown to if you had put more money in, or regularly added to your investment over that year, or just picked the top stocks for a longer stretch of time. However, it goes without saying, this is a very extreme example. We can't realistically expect anyone to pick the best performing stock consistently month after month or year after year for any appreciable amount of time. That being said, there are many more reasonable sounding ways to optimize our finances, many of which can be extraordinarily beneficial, but there is a potential trap that we can sometimes find ourselves falling into when pursuing these optimizations. And that trap is allowing the optimal to become the enemy of the successful. Today I'm going to be going over some common ways that people have, unfortunately, over-optimize themselves out of financial success, and why those optimizations can be so tempting and at the same time potentially so damaging to our finances.
But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below,
which includes a link to my Patreon page. This is the best way to show your support for this channel, and in addition to that, you can also get early access to new videos and exclusive content such as spreadsheets based off the ideas we discuss in these videos. The spreadsheets will allow you to play with your own numbers and see how big of a difference some of the ideas we discuss can make for your own personal financial situation. The first potential over-optimization related trap that people can find themselves falling into is trying to find the optimal asset allocation. Now, don't get me wrong, it is possible to find an optimal asset allocation for yourself. None of these potential traps that I'm discussing today are inherently bad ideas. It's just that sometimes we can take the goal behind the idea to an extreme where it ends up doing more damage than it does good. In the case of finding the optimal asset allocation, this generally comes in one of two forms. The first form is when we find ourselves looking through the historical data and choosing an asset allocation based on its long-run performance in the past, without any regard to whether or not we'd be comfortable with the ups and downs associated with those long-term results in the real world. This potential oversight can be damaging, especially when the asset allocation in question contains a good amount of volatile investments, such as stocks or other more speculative assets. Because if we happen to hit a bit of market turbulence and panic sell as a result, or find ourselves in a situation where we're forced to sell our investments due to life circumstances like a medical emergency or job loss, we can lose a lot of money very quickly. And depending on the severity of the circumstances, that can set our financial progress back anywhere from a few months to several years. The second form is when we find ourselves poring over that historical data and comparing it to what we perceive the current market environment to be in order to determine which setup would be the most profitable, particularly in the short term. This potential oversight can be detrimental because it ignores the fact that two seemingly similar environments can yield shockingly different results for any individual asset. It's important to remember that while history often does rhyme, it doesn't usually repeat itself verbatim. Let's take a second to put some numbers to these hypotheticals to paint the picture a little more clearly. For the first form of this trap, which has us looking over long-term historical data to determine the optimal asset allocation for ourselves, let's consider John. John is a fairly adventurous person when it comes to his finances. He's 30 years old, takes home about $30,000 a year, and has a savings rate of about 10%. He's also got something else, some really big dreams that $3,000 a year in savings simply won't enable him to achieve under normal circumstances, such as being able to retire by the time he's 45. Therefore, he's determined to find a way to maximize how hard his money works for him by increasing the returns he earns on his investments. As a result, he's decided to look back at the historical data to determine what asset allocation is likely to produce the strongest returns for him, and he lands on stocks, which, while historically pretty volatile, is an asset class that has some of the highest long-term return ceilings. John goes all in. Unfortunately, the year is 2000. And the stock market is about to experience a lost decade. After the markets tanked by about 50% during the dot-com crash of the early 2000s, John panics and sells his investments. By about 2004, it seemed like the markets were starting to recover, so John managed to work up the nerve to jump back in. And for a few years there, things went pretty well. In fact, by late 2007, John's initial investment would have grown in value under this hypothetical to be worth around $28,000. But we all know what happened to the stock market and the broader economy in 2008. 2008. By January 2009, John loses his job, and because he went all in on the stock market, he didn't have much of an emergency fund on the sidelines to cover his expenses in such a scenario. After all, the stock market tends to appreciate in value much more than cash over the long run, according to historical data. So it seemed like a much better use of money on paper. That means that John had to sell his investments in order to put food on the table after being laid off. By July 2009, just 7 months after his job loss, his entire net worth would have evaporated. Talk about a lost decade. Clearly, this was not the optimal asset allocation for John. Yes, he happened to hit quite a rough patch in the 2000 stock market, but he was also in a situation where an all-stock approach probably wouldn't have been the best approach for him regardless. He didn't stomach the volatility very well during the dot-com crash of the early 2000s, and he didn't have his ducks in a row in the form of an emergency fund, so that when he lost his job, he was forced to sell his historically volatile investments in order to make ends meet. If he was someone who the volatility wouldn't have bothered very much, and he did have his ducks in a row, we could be having a very different conversation. But again, this is the potential trap that we can fall into when we try to make decisions based purely on what we see on paper, without taking adequate time to think through what the reality of that on-paper experience would be like. A similar outcome could come from the second form of this trap, where we compare the current perceived market environment to past market environments in order to determine which is likely to produce the best returns, especially in the short term. For instance, we've been dealing with high levels of inflation for the last year or two, causing many to harken back to the inflationary 1970s. One of the best assets to hold during those inflationary times was gold. When the US went off the gold standard in the early 1970s, it experienced tremendous returns, even breaking into the triple digits on an annualized basis at some points. However, the same has thus far not been true in the 2020s. Since the summer of 2021, when inflation first clocked in at above 5% on a yearly basis, gold has seen its value fluctuate from a starting point of around $1,890 to as high as $1,980 and as low as about $1,700. As of this writing in late August 2022, it's sitting at about $1,760. In other words, it hasn't even kept up with inflation during this time period. And that's true even if we look back to January of 2020, before the downturn really got going, to get a more full scope of this recent cycle. The same cannot be said for all other types of assets. The S&P 500, for example, has posted a positive real return since the start of 2020, despite its recent downturn in the first half of this year. The second potential over-optimization related trap that people can find themselves falling into is the optimal investment opportunity. Now again, just like with the optimal asset allocation, there is the potential to find the optimal investment opportunity. I mean, just look at the figures we went over from the beginning of this video. I mean, the kinds of returns you can get by picking a top-performing asset at the right time and getting out of it at the right time can be tremendous. But there is a chance that we may take it too far and pass up an investment opportunity that's likely to be good enough for our situation and goals in favor of an investment opportunity that has the potential to be life-changing, for better or for worse. These life-changing investments can come from many sources. Some examples include scammers trying to sell you get-rich-quick schemes, or investing secrets that'll lead to significant increases in your wealth, to overfit or otherwise misleading investment and market timing models, and of course, our own fear and greed responses to market movements. Regardless of the source, however, falling for this potential trap can prove incredibly damaging to our finances. We already saw that play out in the previous section when John was comparing market environments to try and pick the best short-term investment. This would be one example of the greed response to potential market movements. Another would be buying into a market bubble after it has experienced a substantial run-up. We also saw the fear response in that section, when John panicked and sold his investments when the stock market tanked during the dot-com crash. However, it's one thing to pick an investment that doesn't perform quite as well as some of the alternatives. That's something that every single one of us is going to do probably many times throughout our lives. It's quite another to genuinely lose most or all of your time and or funds to a scammer. The reason for this is that if the scammer is trying to sell you a secret investing strategy, then there's probably a good chance that that strategy has not been publicly tested, at least very thoroughly and transparently. And the reality is that it often takes multiple economic cycles for the investment models that are just a bit off to reveal themselves as such. This is because, as we just went over, while history often rhymes, it doesn't necessarily repeat itself verbatim. So a model that appears to be sound on one historical instance, which is often the case for these secret investing strategies, they're often cherry-picked to some degree, it could just mean that that strategy was lucky the first time around. Until we see it perform across multiple cycles and economic environments, it's difficult to say for sure. And when I lay it out like this, it sounds really obvious that following this secret investment advice is probably not a great idea. And in some cases, it really is that obvious. But that's not always the case. Not every investing strategy is presented in the cliched, I have a secret investing strategy that'll make you millions of dollars kind of way. And truth be told, sometimes they're not actually being peddled by scammers at all. They're just being discussed by regular people who are excited to have found something that they believe will lead to them being highly successful and profitable investors. But either way, the potential pitfalls remain more or less the same. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, and if someone's trying to get you to buy into a secret investing strategy without allowing you to test it across multiple historical environments before pledging your funds, it's probably best to turn away. But if you do lose your money to a genuine scammer, there could be another kind of loss to take into consideration. Beyond the fact that your money is just gone, being duped by a scammer can be very embarrassing. In some cases, this can have a knock-on effect of lowering your tolerance for risk for a long time going forward. And while we never want to take excessive or unnecessary risks financially, it is generally understood that some level of strategic risk-taking can be very beneficial to building long-term lasting wealth. Whether those risks come in the form of starting your own business or side hustle, or investing in markets that you don't have complete control over. It's possible that after being scammed, risks like these may not seem nearly as palatable, at least for a little while, and those opportunity costs need to be considered as well. A third potential over-optimization related trap that people can find themselves falling into is the optimal growth opportunity. This trap is often closely related to the ideas of the optimal asset allocation and optimal investment opportunity, with the distinguishing factor here being the use of some sort of leverage to maximize growth. The thing to remember with leverage is that it is always a double-edged sword. It can maximize losses just as easily as it can maximize returns. For examples of both sides of that coin, look no further than this chart from Portfolio Visualizer, showing the growth of a $10,000 investment into an S&P 500 index fund, in blue, and a leveraged fund that looks to double the daily returns of the S&P 500, in red, from July 2006 to July 2022. Obviously, during this particular time period, the leveraged fund performed better, amassing an ending net worth of around $69,400 compared to $44,300 for the regular index fund, but certainly not without some substantial bumps in the road. The leveraged fund lost over 81% of its value during the Great Recession in 2008, compared to the 50% loss suffered by the index fund itself. And unfortunately, that's not atypical for these types of investments. Leveraged approaches tend to maximize losses during the exact same time periods that it's most difficult to dig ourselves out of financial holes and mistakes through other means, meaning it typically struggles during economic downturns, such as the Great Recession or the early portion of 2020, where it's often tougher to pick up extra work or otherwise generate additional income to make up for the shortfall than it would be during booming economic times. Now, these are far from the only potential areas where we can let optimal be the enemy of successful, but I think these examples get the point across fairly well, so I'll leave you with this. If you ever find yourself in a situation, whether it's with your budget, your career opportunities, your investments, or some other part of your financial life, remember this: as unsexy as it might seem on the surface, at the end of the day, good enough is good enough. First, figure out a way to reliably reach your goal, whatever that goal may be. And only once you've reached it should you consider taking on the far riskier but potentially far more highly rewarding options at your disposal, with whatever resources you can actually afford to lose without falling off the mountaintop that you've arrived at.
But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. I generally upload every single Monday, and if you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.